We often believe that the most profound insights into a person's character are found in their loudest declarations and most visible actions. However, the most revealing psychological data often leaks out through the quietest gaps in their logic and the subtle patterns of their daily speech. What if the very ways people attempt to appear certain are actually the clearest indicators that they have stopped thinking altogether? Consider the last time you sat in a crowded room and listened to a conversation that felt strangely hollow despite its volume. You might have noticed how some individuals speak with an intensity that seems designed to drown out any possibility of internal doubt. There is a peculiar tension in the air when someone defends a position they haven't actually explored, yet they cling to it like a life raft. It is a common human experience to encounter those who use language not to reveal truth, but to signal an identity they haven't earned. We see it in the workplace, at dinner tables, and across the digital landscapes where opinions are traded like currency without any backing gold. The gap between a person's perceived intellect and their actual cognitive engagement is a chasm filled with fascinating psychological artifacts and defensive maneuvers. Why is it that those who know the least often seem the most convinced of their own absolute and unwavering authority on a subject? This phenomenon is not merely a social annoyance. It is a fundamental window into the mechanics of the human ego and its protective shells. Arthur Schopenhauer once remarked that every man takes the limits of his own field of vision for the limits of the world. This observation points to a hidden psychological mechanism where the absence of thought is not experienced as a vacuum, but as a completed picture. When the mind stops questioning, it does not feel empty. Instead, it feels satisfied with the shallowest possible explanation of reality. We are entering a realm where the unaware person is not someone who lacks information, but someone who lacks the tools to process it. Observers of human nature have long understood that intellectual humility is the first casualty of a mind that has prioritized social survival over truth. Carl Jung suggested that thinking is difficult, which is precisely why most people choose to judge instead of engaging in the process. Judgment provides an immediate conclusion, a resting place for the brain that requires far less caloric energy than the sustained effort of analysis. The patterns we are about to explore are the footprints of a mind that has retreated into the safety of prepackaged ideas and emotional reactions. Understanding these quiet exposures is like learning a new language, one where the pauses and the cliches tell a much larger story than the words. By identifying these markers, we can begin to see the invisible architecture of human thought and the scaffolding that supports its absence. At the core of this behavior lies a phenomenon often referred to in modern psychology as the Dunning-Kruger effect, though its roots are ancient. It describes a cognitive bias where people with low ability at a task overestimate their ability because they lack the metacognition to see their errors. To know that you do not know requires a certain level of knowledge, a baseline of understanding that allows you to see the boundaries. Without that baseline, the individual is trapped in a loop where their own incompetence shields them from the realization of their lack of depth. Daniel Kahneman, in his work on thinking systems, explains how our brains prefer the fast track of intuition over the slow track of logic. The fast system thrives on patterns, stories, and ease, while the slow system requires deliberate, often painful, mental labor and focused concentration. Unaware people often operate entirely within the fast system, accepting the first plausible-sounding thought as an objective and unshakable truth of the universe. This reliance on mental shortcuts creates a false sense of fluency, where the ease of recalling a slogan is mistaken for the depth of understanding. When a person stops thinking, they begin to rely on availability heuristics, favoring information that is most recent or emotionally charged in their memory. The ego plays a massive role here, acting as a specialized security guard that filters out any information that might cause cognitive dissonance or shame. To admit a lack of understanding is to admit a vulnerability, and for many, the ego perceives this vulnerability as a direct threat to survival. Therefore, the mind constructs a shell of certainty that protects the individual from the terrifying possibility that they might be wrong or uninformed. This shell is not made of facts, but of emotional convictions and social reinforcements that prioritize belonging over the pursuit of actual objective truth. Nietzsche observed that people will often cling to a conviction even when it is proven false because it provides a sense of stable orientation. The lack of thinking is not a passive state. It is an active avoidance of the complexity that defines our chaotic and multifaceted human existence. It is a retreat into the binary, where things are either good or evil, right or wrong, with no room for the gray. In the modern world, this lack of thinking often manifests as the rehearsed opinion, where individuals repeat phrases they have heard elsewhere without modification. You might notice this in a professional setting when a colleague uses buzzwords to mask a fundamental misunderstanding of the project's actual core goals. They speak in circles, using the vocabulary of expertise as a cloak, hoping the aesthetic of intelligence will substitute for the substance of it. In social circles, this appears as the person who is never wrong, turning every disagreement into a battle of wills rather than an exchange of ideas. These individuals often interrupt others, not because they have a counterpoint, but because they are waiting for the next opportunity to reassert their static position. The digital age has exacerbated this, as social media rewards the quick, the bold, and the simplistic over the nuanced or the deeply considered. People now curate their intellectual identities by sharing headlines they haven't read, further distancing their public persona from their actual internal cognitive processing. In relationships, a lack of thinking shows up as a refusal to consider the perspective of the other person, as doing so would require mental flexibility. Instead of curious inquiry, the unaware person offers platitudes, generic advice that sounds wise but fails to address the specific complexities of the situation. This reliance on clichés is a subtle exposure, signaling that the speaker has reached the end of their mental runway and is now gliding. They use thought-terminating clichés, phrases like "it is what it is," to shut down deeper exploration of a problem that requires real effort. Observe how they react to ambiguity. The unaware mind finds the unknown to be an enemy that must be conquered with immediate, shallow labels. They rarely ask questions that begin with why or how, preferring instead to make declarations that begin with obviously or everyone knows. This performative certainty is a mask for a deep-seated fear of being seen as intellectually inadequate or socially disconnected from their chosen peer group. It is a quiet tragedy, as the person believes they are projecting strength, while observers see the rigid fragility of a mind that cannot bend. Deeper still, we find that unawareness is often characterized by a lack of narrative complexity in how one views their own personal life history. The unaware person tells a story of their life where they are always the hero or the victim, never the complex antagonist or the flawed witness. They lack what psychologists call integrative complexity, the ability to recognize multiple perspectives and synthesize them into a coherent, nuanced whole of understanding. Marcus Aurelius noted that everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact. Everything we see is a perspective, not the absolute and final truth. The individual who has stopped thinking treats their own perspective as the only possible reality, effectively closing the doors to any further intellectual growth. This leads to a pattern of confabulation, where the brain invents reasons for its actions after the fact to maintain the illusion of rational control. They aren't lying to you, they are lying to themselves, and you are simply a witness to the internal fabrication of their personal reality. This process is often signaled by an over-reliance on categorical thinking, placing people and ideas into boxes that can never be opened or rearranged. When you challenge one of these boxes, the reaction is often emotional rather than logical, because you are challenging their fundamental sense of psychological safety. They might use ad hominem attacks, focusing on your character rather than your argument, because their mind cannot process the argument itself without breaking. Another layer is the curse of knowledge in reverse, where they assume that because they understand a surface-level detail, they understand the entire system. They mistake familiarity for mastery, believing that because they have heard of a concept, they have integrated its profound implications into their life. This leads to a static worldview where no new information is allowed to change the internal map, regardless of how outdated that map becomes. The philosopher Robert Greene points out that the greatest power comes from being able to see things as they are, not as we wish. Unaware people are constantly viewing the world through the lens of their wishes, fears, and inherited biases, never cleaning the glass of their perception. They are often the most susceptible to groupthink, adopting the opinions of their tribe to avoid the loneliness of independent, critical, and rigorous thought. The lack of thinking is quietly exposed when someone cannot explain why they believe something beyond stating that it is common sense or widely accepted. They become a mirror of their environment rather than a source of original light, reflecting whatever ideas happen to be dominant in their immediate surroundings. The most brutal realization is that this lack of thinking is not a sign of a broken brain, but a brain working exactly as evolved. Our biological ancestors didn't always need to be right about the cosmos. They needed to be part of a tribe and avoid being eaten. The human mind is primarily designed for survival and social cohesion, not for the objective pursuit of abstract or uncomfortable philosophical truths. Therefore, the person who seems unaware is often just someone whose survival mechanisms are perpetually stuck in the on position, blocking out nuance. They are not intentionally trying to be ignorant. They are emotionally unable to handle the instability that comes with genuine, transformative intellectual doubt. Doubt is a high-level cognitive state that requires a secure sense of self to navigate without falling into a state of paralyzing existential anxiety. When the self is fragile, certainty becomes a psychological necessity, a wall built to keep the chaos of a complex world at a manageable distance. The tragedy is that the more someone hides behind this wall, the more they lose touch with the reality that could actually help them grow. They become trapped in a cognitive feedback loop where they only seek out information that confirms their existing biases and strengthens their internal walls. This is why arguing with an unaware person is often futile. You aren't fighting their logic, you are fighting their fundamental sense of self-preservation. Their lack of thinking is a protective armor, and your attempts to introduce nuance are perceived as an attempt to strip that armor away. The realization that we are all, at times, that person is the beginning of true psychological maturity and the end of intellectual arrogance. It is easy to point out the lack of thinking in others, but it is much harder to see the gaps in our own internal logic. We all have blind spots, areas of our lives where we have stopped asking questions and started accepting the first comfortable answer that we find. Think of a topic you feel very strongly about. Can you accurately describe the strongest possible argument for the opposing side of that specific issue? If you cannot, you may be experiencing the very lack of thinking that you find so frustrating when you see it in other people. Every time we reach for a cliché instead of a considered thought, we are quietly exposing our own mental fatigue or our hidden fears. Reflect on the last time you were proven wrong. Did you feel a sense of curiosity, or did you feel a sudden, hot flash of defensive anger? That anger is the signal that your ego has stepped in to replace your intellect, marking the exact moment where your thinking has ceased. The goal is not to be a perfect thinker, as such a thing does not exist, but to be a person who is aware of their own cognitive limitations. The antidote to this quiet exposure is the cultivation of radical curiosity, the habit of asking why, especially when you think the answer is obvious. It requires the courage to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, resisting the urge to reach for a shallow label or a prepackaged opinion. Humility is not thinking less of yourself. It is thinking of yourself less, allowing the world to exist without your immediate judgment or categorization. When we practice intellectual honesty, we become more aware of the shortcuts our minds take, and we can choose to take the longer, more rewarding path. This shift changes how we speak, moving us away from declarations of certainty and toward the collaborative exploration of life's many mysteries and paradoxes. By recognizing the patterns of unawareness in ourselves, we develop a deeper empathy for others who are still trapped in their unprotective cognitive shells. In the end, the quiet exposure of a lack of thinking is a reminder of our shared human struggle to make sense of a vastly complex universe. The path to wisdom is not paved with the bricks of certainty, but with the stones of persistent, humble, and often uncomfortable inquiry into the unknown. If we can learn to value the process of thinking over the comfort of being right, we open ourselves to a much richer and more authentic experience. True intelligence is not found in having all the answers, but in having the resilience to keep asking the questions that truly matter for our growth. As you move through the world today, notice where you feel the urge to be certain and where you might choose instead to be curious about what you see. What is one belief you hold that you have never truly challenged, and what might happen if you looked at it with fresh and skeptical eyes? Share your thoughts on how we can all stay more aware in a world that often rewards the loudest, most unthinking voices in the room.